freue mich sehr, dieses Panel moderieren zu können.
I'm pleased to be your moderator today. We'll be talking about globalization, have wonderful experts with us from historic, economic, and geopolitical point of view. They've been able to follow these developments and can shed some light on that for us. I'd like to introduce the panelists to us to begin with. Let's begin with Monika Schnitzer, who is a professor for comparative economic research at the University in Munich and is also chairman of the Council of Experts, the Council of Economic Experts. Then to my left, Dr. Stefan Oschmann, who was CEO at Bern, is now partner at Amira Beteiligung and chairman of the ICURIS AG. Then we have Dr. Gabriel Felbermayr, who's the director of the Austrian Institute for Economic Research and professor for at the Vienna University of Economics and Business in Vienna. Then we have Dr. Jörn Leonhard, who is professor for modern and most recent history in Western Europe at the University in Freiburg. And then we have Dr. Wittig, who is a former ambassador for the Federal Republic of Germany in London and Washington, and now a senior advisor for global affairs at the Scheffler Group. Thank you all for being here today. I think it's a good idea now to transition from what we've just heard. Let's begin with the historic perspective. And I'd like to ask Mr. Leonhard, or Dr. Leonhard, we've seen waves of globalization, different developments, which can make globalization more highlighted or less highlighted. What can we say about the most recent decades here in this respect? I think it's important to realize that it's not just one type of globalization. In history, we're concerned with different aspects of globalization. For example, the history of China and what we see from the European point of view when it comes to Middle Ages, the question of the first Silk Road, for example, just one of many. This is real globalization. Let's take Michael Ignatieff just talked about the era of revolutions between 1776 and 1850s, for instance. It's not only transatlantic and French, it's also something that happens in other parts of the world as well. Let's take the years that we see now as globalization prior to globalization, that is to say 1914. Those are the big winners, the German Empire and the United States. And then we see Siemens and Thales. This was 98% of all of the underwater cables were produced by them, and this was the internet prior to World War I. It's not a history of the modern news agencies without the markets, and this is the infrastructure of modern communication. And then we see American economists have said that up until the 80s, it took until the 80s before the Federal Republic of Germany was at the level of the economic development worldwide, which we had during the period of the emperors. And then we have the 1920s and 30s. And I think this is important for our discussion when we talk about globalization. We see connectivity and disconnectivity. And we had the League of Nations, standardization. We had the athletic competition, worldwide events, radios, and then we had new types and ideas with autarky. And we see that if we sum this all up, I think we have to come away from the idea of container globalization. We have to see what is very special about the globalization that we now have. And we have to move away from the idea that it's only legalization. We have the counter movements as well. In the 1870s, we had the cells. We also had the closing off of economic areas. You have ideas that you can survive independently. Then we'll maybe get a better idea as to what globalization is today compared to the historic processes. Thank you very much. Now, let's come to the present, or if we take a look at bringing the historic view to the present now. Since the end of the Second World War, we've had a multilateral system which is now under pressure, especially looking at the World Trade Organization. Now, if I ask Mr. Felbermayr, what are the aspects which are of great significance to us? Multilateral, bilateral, and what is most important here?
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank Mr. Leonhard for his presentation. After the Second World War, we did not start in a multilateral way. We had the concept of multilateralisms, but we had an international society now being 133 countries, but maybe minus ones. But again, you have to see the development. There are two principles in this world, the World Trade Organization. They are essential. One is non-discrimination. There is the most favored nation clauses. This is a big, say, connecting band. That is, you are not supposed to treat the trade partners in a different manner. So, equal tariffs to different trade partners. Now, this might be or is considered to be a way of, reducing abuse of power. And then we had many other aspects. It must be made sure that these tariffs are being maintained. And now we suddenly find out that the United States, who's been on board right from the beginning, a member of this World Trade Organization, they founded it. Now these, without batting an eyelid, they are breaking these respective rules, that any regulations which have been agreed on, 2.5%, tariffs on cars, for instance, they are now part of a negotiation, 15%, 25%, 15%, 10%, 50% maybe. Who knows? Maybe we're going to hear it tomorrow. That's one thing. Next thing is that, you might enter into different agreements with different countries. Japan 15%, Canada still negotiating, Europe. Maybe tomorrow they will know where we are going. Then smaller countries, 50-60%, because they are small. So this is a bilateral kind of approach, and all this shows us that the multilateral order which is developed after the Second World War is kind of crumbling. And I believe uncertainty is very important. Unsecurity, this might be more. But you are no longer sure where you stand. First, let's talk about the deal. Now, is it not like the WTO rights, or that somebody says, okay, we are talking about deals which are legally binding, but maybe they are not, because the very next day, they are being broken, they are being violated, infringed. So that's one of the problems. Second World War, and after the Second World War, and this may be up to the last 15 years. We had the world trade structures. You can talk about the World Health Organization, then the IMF, the World Bank. So you can also mention them, of course. They stand for the entire system under the umbrella of the United Nations. And this is something which emerged after the Second World War. So there's ongoing uncertainty. So we've got certainties which are broken immediately, then new negotiations might be necessary or are started. And, this is really the strength of the law, but it is the power of the stronger person. Say, all this, what has been established, was a kind of miracle. We do not have a world policeman, making sure that the rules are being abided by, but it was self-enforcing, all this. It was in the mutual interest to comply with the rules. The WTA made this or that available, and then there are essays saying how the WTA has, brought about corporations. And then, of course, the contrast is anarchy. Anarchy means that the right of the stronger one will prevail. So this is the world which we seem to move in right now. But on the other hand, we also have to bear in mind that the United States, of course, in dollar, are the largest economy in the world, but 15% of the world trade is, comes from the United States. 15%, 85% now, 85%. Just think of that, come from other countries. Our friends in Japan, Canada, maybe in China, the rest of the world, and they always try to save what they hope can be saved. Now, talking about this -1 idea, membership -1, then of course this is the elephant in the room we are talking about, particularly when talking about further aspects. And this, of course, brings us to the question, how can we handle that? All the executive orders coming from President Trump bring a lot of uncertainties. My question to Mrs. Schnitzer, what is the best strategy Europe has it right now?
Well, I think that we first have to think about the fact that no agreement will really hold. I think we have to be aware about that. This is a longer period of insecurity, and we also have to ask ourselves, what do we want to achieve? I think we have to see, we know what Trump wants to achieve. He wants the best for himself, literally speaking. He says the best for his country, and he also wants to make use of tariffs so that he can generate income, which then can be offset with taxes, for example. We'll let the foreigners pay for it, and then this is something that will go into the American funds. So we have to see how that works, because at the end of the day, we'll see that it's the Americans in the final analysis who will be paying the bill. But these are things that we have to be aware of. We have to know what we want to achieve, and we want to know what we can agree to. And at this point, we also have to make it even clearer. We have things to lose, but we also are strong. We have strengths, and I think this is not expressed often enough. So right now, we really don't know. We're saying, well, he threatened us with 20%, but maybe it'll only be 10. That'll be okay, and that's something that we could live with. But now he's threatening 30%. He said, well, if it's only 15, well, that would be okay. Well, maybe he'll come along tomorrow and want 40, and then come up with 20, so it's not as bad as we thought it might be. But we really don't know what we can do in return. And we've heard, of course, we can also trade with other countries. And we're not only talking about goods, we're also talking about services, imports. We import more from the United States than the Germans export. This is something that Trump doesn't talk about. We can talk about that. So we do have something that we can use against all of this. So we can say, right, if you want to irritate us in this way, then we will aggravate you as well. We're not doing it all that much right now. We aren't really showing him the instruments we have because we count on balance. We still hope that it won't be as bad as all that. 10%, well, okay, maybe we can live with that. But my fear is that Trump is not going to stand still. We'll have to say, okay, if you want to go further and further, then of course we can do something about it. And we have all sorts of instruments we can use. For example, when it comes to digital imports, certain things we will tax ourselves. For example, we might have a tax there when it comes to the income from digital platforms. Then this could be 40% of their earnings. Okay, then we'd have something we can use. We can have counter tariffs for certain products, and something that maybe the Republican senators have be affected by this. So maybe they too could turn against Trump. So there are possibilities that we have, and I think that we should do so. Well, maybe one more question on this. When you take a look at some academic studies, you'll see that the insecurity is more than it's ever been before. This is compared to the financial crisis in 2008 and the migration crisis, Corona, the Russian war against Ukraine. So this whole idea of insecurity seems to be even more than it was in the past. So the question is, what is worse, the tariffs or the insecurity? Insecurity at the end of the day, because if anything that is certain is something that you can live with. We have certain tariffs, okay. Do I want to export to them at all? Do I have to then increase my productivity so that I can manage to deal with all of this? You could think about this. Or am I going to withdraw from that market? So once I know what the situation is, then the question is, where should I invest? Should I produce? Should I not? German companies have gone to Mexico so that they would be closer to the market, because that was also part of a common economic area. And then under Biden, they thought about going to the United States due to the Inflation Reduction Acts. And now this has all been canceled. So all of this, of course, makes things very difficult. Our reaction is difficult. And my concern is that at the end of the day, we will be avoiding this economic area more than before. So that is a very good transition to my question for Mr. Oschmann. And this insecurity or uncertainty and strategies that we have to develop will have to be different than what they've been in the past. So for you, what is the best way to deal with this insecurity, tariffs, etc.?
Meiner Meinung nach gefährlich, aber gleichzeitig ist es eine große Chance für Europa und für Deutschland. Wir haben die Chance, dass wir endlich erwachsen werden. Dass wir, so wie Norbert Röttgen hat es so klar definiert, das deutsche Erfolgsmodell basierte darauf, dass die Sicherheit aus USA kam, kostenlos, die billige Energie kam aus Russland und das Wachstum kam aus China. Nichts davon funktioniert mehr. Und das war auch nicht wirklich sustainable in diesem Sinne. Also wir haben jetzt die Chance, dass wir uns verteidigungsmäßig ordentlich aufstellen. Wir diskutieren sehr viel über digitale Souveränität. Wir haben nichts in der Beziehung gemacht. Wir diskutieren und handeln auch in Bezug auf technologische Souveränität. Wir können in vielen Bereichen sehr viel relativ schnell erreichen, meiner Meinung nach. Also das ist nicht ganz so positiv vielleicht, wie ich es jetzt dargestellt habe, aber netto sehe ich da.
I'm sorry, we had a technical problem up here. Anyway, so companies got used to that. You know, in the past, geopolitics has been an esoteric topic for, you know, managers, leaders of a company. Now you've got supervisory board meetings, board of management meetings. Always geopolitics plays an important role. You know, Roland Berger mentioned this 15 years ago, you know, together with Roland Ischinger. They talked about weaponization of business. And if I remember correctly, you see, the fact that there is a prominent diplomat, becomes an advisor of major companies, means that things have changed. So we have to understand what is happening there. What is it we have to see the trends? What are the trends we have to see? I went to meetings, you know, I listened to many people, very, say, people with a lot of knowledge, and they said, okay, some of the business has to be reduced down to zero. Not because I thought so. No, there were smarter people thinking that this is a good idea. Supply chain. Also, another important point. We, you know, rely on a very globalized system of supply chains. So I can have the raw materials produced in China, then have the process somewhere else, and, you know, then they will be integrated into a final product in Germany, have them packaged in the Philippines, for instance. Now that is changing because it will bring about inefficiencies, but it will, increase resilience, just in time to just in case. This is the trend we are seeing now. Now, tariffs and diplomacy of tariffs. Now that's something which is shown in a very dramatic way. I believe it's not so, say, drastic or dramatic. We will probably be in a position that we can handle that. And, you know, the Bavarian philosopher always say, okay, let's see what's going to happen. Let's simply see. Okay, so of course, the situation is dangerous, but all in all, it's a coherent situation. The United States, America, has got a national debt of 40 trillion and the United States pay 3 billion in interest every day. And of course, lots of economic growth has been generated because of that money. You know, because of borrowed money. Now, the American budget is not a sustainable one. You have to do things about it, because otherwise, you know, you might say, okay, increase taxes. A Republican can never do that. And then, you know, the Trump administration, they will, address, the tariffs, which is like increasing a VAT. But, I can always blame things on the bad, say, aliens. Maybe I will have some kind of income stream in my budget, but I will not violate American principles. There's a weak dollar, and you can achieve that, of course, in order to bolster up exports. And here the Americans say, we've got lots and lots of money we have to spend. We have to pay our defense or our military. We have to focus on Asia. And the Europeans, they are the ones who are supposed to do things themselves. Well, these are things which we might not like, but, on the other hand, they are to some extent also rational. And what's new about it, right-wing populists always gave in when it comes to people crossing borders, and the left ones, they always kind of gave in when it comes to the flow of goods. So maybe this is what's happening right now. Only the left Democrats, well, they've got this tariff thing, and this is a very interesting left and right-wing populist topic.
I do believe that this is all quite rational, because the success at the elections, I don't think he will achieve what he promised. Okay, I agree with you 100%, that jobs will come back in the automotive industry or in the steel industry. This is not going to happen. So the people who elected him are going to notice that sooner or later, and the next guy will offer them something else. Okay, Ms. Flick has drawn our attention to an article in the Financial Times. It's called The New Age of Geoeconomics. That's what Mr. Oschmann was just talking about. And he referred to Dr. Wittig. What does that mean, geoeconomics? So these are the aspects that we might want to see behind this. And tariffs are one part of this. There's a whole lot more behind that. What aspects do we need to take into account here, and should we be interested in? Well, of course, we have to come to an agreement with the American president. We can't avoid that. When we talk about geopolitical distortions that we're now talking about, what's important here is for us to realize that Trump is a disruptor, and he is changing all of the relationships, but this is a symptom of mega trends driven by the United States, and these are perhaps even mega trends worldwide. True, Mr. Trump is the king of tariffs, and he is giving tariffs magic powers, but protectionism goes beyond Trump. That's a mega trend in the United States, and even his predecessor governments also tried to protect domestic industries and to lead to reindustrialization. Reindustrialization, that will remain. And then to combine questions of security and trade, that is also a mega trend. And here we see secular rivalries between the United States and China. The United States want to contain China. Containment is the buzzword. So here you see that this also is related to security thinking, keeping China down. And so these trends that we also had to a certain extent in the past, and now what we see is the fact that the institutions, multilateral order that we had all become so accustomed to, we can't just ignore that. They're now being destroyed, at least in part. They're assisting in their destruction. The WTO was mentioned, and we consider that the World Trade Organization has died for many Americans. And I think that this will go beyond Trump. There are other examples as well. The American relief aid. Lots of countries are being affected by the fact that this has been suspended, and also the fact that they have left certain parts of the United Nations, UNESCO, the WHO, etc. But behind all of that, we see there's a philosophy, and that is that the international system is to be based on the sovereignty of individual states, not multilateral cooperation. But that is the principle of international systems. Now, that is what leads us to the fact that he does not respect multilateral organizations, including the EU. During Trump's first term of office, I heard that not only the EU was worse than China, they're a rival for us, for the Americans, but the EU is a failing model, is what Trump said. So that's what he wanted. He wanted the EU to collapse. Now, what type of system does he want? That's what we should be asking ourselves. And there have been assumptions that some people are saying, some observers have said that it's a type of the new concert of the great powers, the Congress of Vienna in a different form. I don't believe that. Although Ping and Putin, he says he gets along with them well, but Trump sees and is motivated by this concept. But I think we have to see that this is something that the EU will be concerned with. And this is a question of a transactional and also an opportunistic situation, depending on the situation. In other words, an idea of sovereignty. And this is a problem that we are going to have to struggle with because it is unpredictable. In other words, this whole approach is unpredictable, and this is based on the American military hard power. And we have a very strong position, and we can talk about an imperial presidency in the United States. But this is a system which will be less predictable, less certain, and unreliable. And that brings us to the economy once again. And this is something that the world of economics hates the most. We have to deal with this. It will require a lot of skill, and this will be our fate. Now, if we take this one bit further, when you mentioned China twice, Mr. Leonhard, could you also talk about the development of China? And also if we take a look at this, the fact that suddenly disappearing and then rising again, how do you see this?
Well, there isn't a single important speech by Xi Jinping. Pomerance and great divergence is what the others call it. This means the West and China for a very long time, I can say they had similar conditions as well as ideas, but up until the 16th, 17th or 18th century maybe, the developments ran in parallel, you might say. The gunpowder, China, where it comes from, then the first Silk Road, and many other examples in this respect. And then, of course, and this is the narrative, then the world is being subdued by the West, and China is a victim of this oppression, not necessarily in terms of colonialism, but lopsided contracts, and the Americans, the Brits, the French, and the Germans too. The story Shanghai and also Hong Kong. Now the end is that China in the 20th century, that is after the Second World War, was returning. And listen to the speeches of Xi Jinping, and of course if you listen to the Chinese Academy of Sciences, they always have one conclusion, that is globalization of today, this kind is a kind of accident of the development of the world, and this is being corrected right now. So the second Silk Road 2.0, is just more than a simple economic project. It is a project with which China wants to show that China is the imperial power. And this is something which we noticed during the coronavirus pandemic, because China used its own health kind of power to show, and we see it in economic terms, but we also see it when you have these historical references. Silk Road 2.0, it is also a kind of historical, history-political say, construct. And the second important aspect, and Xi Jinping always mentioned it, is 1919. Now, the big promise of liberal internationalism, of Woodrow Wilson, self-determination, and then, you know, Poland, Czechs, Slovaks, the Southern Slavs, it was true for them, but it did not apply to China. People always say that this also does not apply to the Arabs, but nevertheless, you know, in principle, we can say, and this is based on this, you know, China has been put on a course. This treason by the West is to be, say, is to be compensated, you know, going to other countries. Let me follow up on that. What about the Europe's? How do they handle the United States, and then how do they handle China? Well, I'd like to anticipate one idea. You know, China, the history of China, or the current situation and the current discussions which we have, you know, international relations can run very differently. Talking about economics, first term, we talk about trade. Yes, trade is good for everyone. We are trying mutual trade, and everyone is doing what they can do best, and the others follow. And this for each and every country, yes, we will be richer at the end of the day. And China didn't experience it like this. So is it a trained, you know, on a level playing field? There is those who do not really want to cheat each other, but, you know, want to work together, so to speak. And obviously it was not the case at the time when dealing with China. And I believe Trump is doing the same thing, you know, saying that we, the Europeans, you know, you were abusing us, the Americans. And, you know, these are very different things. And, you know, if we talk about equal partners, equally strong, so to speak, then, of course, this will be of benefit for all those involved. And all the various industries, of course, you have to take that into account. Now, China, here it might be possible to negotiate things on a level playing field. But now we have the problem that China says that in certain points they really have something which we do not have. Raw materials, for instance, we definitely need them. Rare earths, for instance, with nothing will work without them. Then other, you know, the developments we see, computer chips, etc., etc. So now we find it a bit difficult to deal with the situation. China, very prudently so, you know, invested a lot in many things so that they can become good in those areas where we were good. Cars, for instance, you know, we invested a lot in the past. We also subsidized a lot, and suddenly they are the ones, you know, showing where to go. Now, my answer to your specific question in this respect, to batten down the hatches, you know, close the doors, that's the wrong way. No, we have to deal with the situation. We have to see how we can improve ourselves, saying this is our future. This is where we want to play a part. This means we have to do our homework, you know, do some catching up. You might say, saying, you know, China will never manage, will never make it. That's what we thought. You know, 15 years ago, people said that. So they are not that creative. They will not be able to come up. And now we see, no, history tells us that the situation is different. The development was different. Well, it was a bit conceited on our side, but nevertheless, now we have to face these challenges, have to see. And my opinion is, do not close the door towards China, but see it as a challenge and do something about it. Let's see what we can improve.
I'd like to pick up on that. I'd like to take it one step further. It's not only competition between German manufacturers in China, but also competition between Chinese and German manufacturers in other parts of the world. So let's take that one step further beyond the U.S. and China. You said 15% of trade is with the United States worldwide. And if we take this one step further, we could say, how does this all fit in? What other economic areas would be important for Europe, Mexico, India, Vietnam, Mercosur, etc.? What do you think is the best way to approach all of this? Well, first of all, I think we have to look at Europe first. Most trade is with ourselves. This is the trade between Salzburg and Lower Austria. that is also something that increases prosperity. And if you think this continues, then you can say, okay, nothing is perfect, of course. Maybe this works quite well in Austria, but once there's a European border in between, we've seen from studies that this is sort of like a tariff. There are no tariffs, but there are bureaucratic differences. There are certain gaps in infrastructure which make trade more difficult. There are different ways of interpreting things. Actually, we have harmonized requirements as to how a directive is to be interpreted. There are differences. So the studies say that within Europe, we have about 45% tariffs. Well, 45%. That is more than what we have to be afraid of from Trump. So I think something could be done. That would be my first proposal. Ms. Schnitzer already mentioned that it would be a bit easier for us to reduce our own barriers rather than to build up new barriers vis-a-vis third parties. And I think this is something that needs to be done. When we talk about this again and again at CONVOCO, what we need to do is wherever something is possible, we have to enter into cooperation agreements and also to contractually agree on this. We're talking about the Mercosur. We've been negotiating with them now for a quarter of a century. Well, what do you notice? We see people frowning. Quarter of a century. This has been a topic ever since then, but it has not really been enshrined anywhere. With Mercosur, with a trade agreement, which is ready to be ratified. We're also negotiating with India, Indonesia. We've got a new agreement now with New Zealand. What about Australia? Nothing's happened there. So my hypothesis is wherever beef is produced, we can't come up with a free trade agreement. So we have to ask ourselves, what's stopping us? The single market, but what stops us when it comes to this question of beef and the question of the geopolitical regulations and necessities? But if we say in Austria, we have a decision against ratifying the Mercosur agreement, well, researchers tell us, let's go ahead and do it. And they say, from agriculture, they say, well, it'd be 0.2% GDP at the most, but 0.2% every year increased income. And Mercosur is only one area where we could do something. There's much more that's possible with India. It's more difficult, but much more is possible. And my final point then is I think that in Europe we do have an opportunity. It's a multilateral system. We shouldn't only use lip service here. We should use all of our political responsibilities. And we should see that this is playing the safe haven that not only the United States will play. We have to abide by the rules. And we have to, when we conclude a contract, it should continue to be valid in the next term of office. We shouldn't just take our own power and bribe in an idea of neocolonialism. No, those are exactly the things that the West did with China. They had unequal agreements. And if we make it very clear to the smaller and poorer countries that we're not going to do that, then we can be an anchor as a reliable, safe haven for this world where the United States are not playing the same game. And at the end of the day, I think that for us, we can secure the prosperity of Europe. We can conclude free trade agreements, and we have to hold on to multilateralism, and I think this is something that we can do. I'd like to pass that on to Mr. Leonhard, the question of contracts that are not on equal terms. I think it was 1843, for example. That was a real trauma. Is what Mr. Felbermayr said, is this a possibility for us to also prevent this trauma from happening in other countries? Well, it would be sort of like something we can learn from history. The fact that the contracts are unequal, we have an economic dimension, but there's also something that is emotional here. Shanghai, this is a city in 1900 where we had French law in the French Quarter, British law in the British Quarter. This is seen as a humiliation, and it's not a coincidence that the Chinese Revolution in that we saw that this was a central location there in Shanghai. This is where the Chinese believed that the Europeans and Americans, they felt that they were humiliated. And this is a location where they want to reconquer their own territory, their own history, their own self-determination. So I mentioned Xi Jinping, and he always talks about economic calculations, but also historic and emotional components. I think both of these belong together. And I think that's a wonderful discussion on the development of history. The earlier colonial powers should get together. Not the U.S. We will take over such a role. And we're talking about coming up with equal agreements, and we will have fair negotiations. But I think we are more adults and we should accept this role. We have to also invest in our defense so that we have military strength and have the necessary technology. But we also have to consider and convince the population. It's also important what they have to say. We should look at the rest of the world, but we also have to see that we're all behind this. We also have to look after the Ukraine. And that's put very nicely. My next two questions for Mr. Osher and Mr. Wittig. I think we have some questions. Is there time for questions from the audience as well? So we're going to have a Q&A in just a minute, but I'd first like to ask Mr. Oschmann, let me ask about the preparation of different companies. Mr. Schnitzer said that this is also something we have to do our homework when it comes to innovation and other aspects compared to China. What do you see as the most important aspects there?
Was dort auch an Negativen passiert, voraussichtlich technologisch.
We see that the Americans will be leading and China is catching up very, very quickly. We've seen that. Just you will remember DeepSeek. It was fascinating to see. And if you think of biotechnology, medicine, China really has done enormous leaps forward. Now, what's important for the Americans, as soon as the Chinese will have problems because of demography, because of the single-child policy, there might be major problems, and there will be some problems. So they might say, okay, we've got a lead of 5 years, and then we or the Americans can remain dominating. Now for us, the Europeans, the Germans, it is all about working with technologies where we can see success. Say quantum technologies, for instance, particularly Germany can do a lot in this respect. Then we have made enormous progress with a view to fusion energy, and in particular Germany could be a leading country. Biotechnology, it really works in Germany in particular. What was the problem? And we've seen that, and we discussed it in a smaller group. This innovation ecosystem and a lack of a missing capital market. We've great scientists, founders. We've got good companies. We've got good managers. All sorts of things, but there is no growth. There is no venture capital made available. And of course, there are several possibilities which we can introduce in order to change things. So, and I hope that things will work out, and I remain an optimist. So my question, from a geopolitical or geo-economical point of view, what are the conditions Europe has to create, the power of innovation, so that we can play this important role? Which role do you mean? I mean the role, having learned the lessons of history, that you do not repeat the mistakes which, led to the humiliation of China, but rather do what the Americans seem to lose, i.e. soft power, so that we can build up soft power in addition to hard power and then take on a leading role. Well, I believe Mr. Felbermayr mentioned it or touched on it briefly. We should not, close the door to China, and we cannot afford to do so anyway, because, the market is so large and the market power is so great. The procurements we see over there. So, but we also have to reduce dependencies at the same time. And this, it's like a dark cloud in the background. You might always have the Taiwan conflict in mind, and something might happen there. So companies start doing local for local production in China for China. That's what some companies are doing. And then add to that, and Mr. Felbermayr mentioned it, new partnerships. And I just remind you of the Commission President von der Leyen. She made a suggestion, that is, get together with, say, or set up a kind of Pacific trade zone, progressive, it might be called, or comprehensive trans-Pacific partnership or something like this. And 11 Pacific, countries coming together, all having the same ideas, might be market-oriented. And by setting up such a partnership, we might, reduce dependencies and have, a kind of nicer world in this area, i.e. shuffle the cards and you start new partnerships like in African or Latin American regions. And last point, I cannot say that we should decouple from the United States, because there's this paradigm, that we've got some kind of equidistance between China and the United States. Well, I don't think it really work, because we have to pay attention in this respect, because America will remain an important and must remain an important for us. And there's a rule I learned, in the United States. The United States are larger than one president. Their force, their power is across the entire country. The senators, the governors, the states, they have to work together. There's a lot of pragmatism, and I believe we should exploit this potential. So we've got one or the other question from the floor.
Go ahead. I think the microphone is coming to you. Please, Jörg van Hoven. One thing I didn't notice in your discussion is politics in the United States. If we are being very cautious there in our approach, especially when it comes to higher tariffs, this is not always seen as the elephant in the room. In other words, we need nuclear protection. I'm sure it's correct to say we have to do our homework, etc. But to say that we have to be even tougher on the United States, this goes against our need for protection, which is pretty strong in the population. Who wants to answer that question? Right. There's a new phenomenon, and I mentioned that earlier on. President Trump is combining security and trade questions, so he can threaten us at any time. If we don't go along with him in trade questions, then he could say he's going to take the troops out of Europe, or he's going to stop his nuclear promise of protection. He hasn't done so yet, and I think this is something that we have to see as a positive message. He hasn't left NATO. Many were afraid they would. And you can say that the NATO summit with the 5% target, that is his success. But up until now, he has not implied that the nuclear screen over Europe would be withdrawn. But it could happen. You don't know. Who knows? But I think up until now, we have, as far as the EU is concerned, we've been quite pragmatic in our position. And I wouldn't be as fearful, because if Trump really were to do that, then of course the markets will react. Because without us, without this large economic area that we are, the United States will also have problems. I can't imagine that this would not lead to a major upheaval. And I think that if markets really decline drastically, what about the American bonds? If everything goes wrong, then Trump personally will lose. And first he threatens with the customs, and then he would have lost considerably. So I can't imagine that he would do this. I'm sorry, there's no microphone. We cannot interpret what is being said. It's the man who asked the question originally. Well, there is one structural point here, and I'd like to say you are right. There is an imbalance, if you like, in Europe's ability to react economically to these crises on the one hand, and then the much more difficult pathway towards a European security policy. There is imbalance there. And as long as we have the nuclear shield, and we cannot compensate for that with European means, and that will take a long time, that's why we need to hope that we can also develop this in the next few years. I think that's a wonderful concluding remark, because I don't want to try to sum things up. What I'd like to do is, if I try to summarize the great findings we've come up with, we see that globalization, we have to see the dimension in time, how have things developed over time, but we also have another question of globalization, of economic security, etc., other aspects as well. And I think this is one aspect which is very important that we keep this all in mind. Thank you all very much to the speakers up on the stage. Thank you for your question, and thank you very much.